One key moment for me, and this is probably a good place to start, is 9/11. And I was a freshman in college when it happened. So here I am living away from home for the first time, trying to figure out the person I want to be and all that kind of thing. And then about 3 weeks into my time at Georgetown, 9/11 happens. And I think that, as an American Muslim, in some sense, it was a tragedy on two levels. First, as an American, but then also as a Muslim, that here were people who claimed to be Muslim, and they were doing these horrifying things in our name. So I think that those were things I had to process early on, and that became quite formative in that it pushed me, it politicized me in some sense, and it pushed me to focus more on the Middle East. I think when I started college, I probably wanted to do something relatively normal, maybe with an international flavor, but I didn't really have this ambition to be a researcher, writer, or academic necessarily. But 9/11, I think, brought out a lot of questions that I began to contend with. And I think one of those questions was, why is the relationship between the US and the Middle East so messed up? Something has gone fundamentally wrong here. And I wanted to understand what that something was. And part of it for me was the issue of authoritarianism. And I sort of knew intuitively that, so I'm born and raised in Pennsylvania, but I'm originally Egyptian. And I lived a year in Egypt when I was younger, and I would spend summers there with my family. And I knew that Egypt was an authoritarian state, that there was a dictator who was in charge. So I had this sense that authoritarianism was part of the problem facing the Middle East. But then I started to look at why the US wasn't doing more to support democracy. Why were we still propping up these authoritarian regimes that had been bad for the region for decades and had contributed to this dysfunction and chaos in the broader region? And that's what led me to ask another question, which was, why are we afraid of democracy in the Middle East? And we support democracy in theory as Americans, but we don't necessarily support it in practice because we're afraid of who might come to power through free and fair elections. Who are those people? Islamist parties. And that's really what led me to focus more and more as I got older on groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist movements and parties that tended to do quite well in elections when they had the chance.
Oh, interesting. So what were you studying when 9/11 happened and you started to have this shift? And then what did you study after that as a result of your change?
Yeah, so I started, I hadn't really decided on my major yet, but it was going to have something to do with international issues. I think that I was leaning more towards international business or international economics at first. Then 9/11 pushed me much more in the direction of politics and US foreign policy. And then I did my master's in Middle Eastern studies, so a very kind of more focused approach to understanding dynamics in the region. And then I did my PhD later on in political science, but my dissertation was on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Jordan. And but I started actually studying the Muslim Brotherhood in a serious way in 2004, 2005. I got a Fulbright fellowship in Jordan, so I spent about 9 months living in Amman, Jordan. And my project was really to just kind of hang out with members and leaders of the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood and to interview a lot of them and to try to understand what does this group stand for, what do they believe in. And I think that my approach from that relatively early age was to really try to immerse myself. When I'm trying to study something, I don't want to look at it from afar. I want to really dive in and actually talk to the people involved. So if you want to understand a controversial group like the Muslim Brotherhood, you can't just read their statements or press releases or documents from the US. You got to go and actually talk to them. There's no, I think, substitute for that. So that's what I did. And it was kind of weird. I think I must have been 21 when I started in 2004. and they were kind of confused, like, who's this American grad student who's so focused on us? And I think I was actually the only Western researcher living in Jordan at that time, focusing on the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood. So I think at first they were suspicious, but then they were like, well, someone cares about us. Okay, this is kind of cool that someone was actually paying attention to them. And Jordan is a country that doesn't tend to get as much attention as, say, Egypt. And I think that they came to find that intriguing, that, here's this guy
Oh,
about us. So that's sort of where it started for me in terms of this particular focus.
and didn't you also spend more time in the Middle East as well?
Yes, I also lived in Egypt at different points after that, and I was, and then after that in Qatar. So those were the three main countries that I lived in the Middle East. When I was younger, I also lived in the UAE for about 2 years. Yeah.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.